Chapter 35. The Fight for Freedom. 15 days since the kidnapping. We need to talk. That was Midoriya, her arms folded as she pouted at the class. Everyone was in the common room at that moment, which is most likely why she had chosen then to begin whatever she was on about. About what? Was Asui's reply. Shinso just sighed and sunk further into his seat, staring at Siren in her nest. He had a bad feeling that, whatever it was, it involved him. It usually did. Their vice representative hesitated for a moment. Maybe it was because she had just assumed everyone had already guessed what she meant. Maybe it was because she was thinking through how to start this. Canary. Joe pulled off her headphones immediately. Uraraka peered over the back of the sofa she had claimed, already decked out in her pajamas. Ida did the same, as he had been trying and failing to explain the math homework that Mr. Ectoplasm had sent them a few days ago to her. The only one remaining was Todoroki, who had just sat down in the chair next to Shinso, a cup of coffee in his hand as he slid a much stronger one over to Shinso. He would need it to get through this. Someone else to note was Bakugo, who got up from his isolated seat in the corner of the room and began to walk towards the stairs up to his room. Bakugo, you need to stay here for this, Yaoyorozu said seriously, giving him a look as he passed her by. He faltered and sighed loudly, before turning around and flopping back down in the nearest available chair, one earphone hanging out as he pressed pause on whatever he was listening to on his phone. Yaoyorozu cleared her throat, clearly a little nervous about the confrontation. Look, it's been over 2 weeks now since the kidnapping and well, we need to sort out our friendships. Shinso groaned and Yaoyorozu glared daggers at him. You're absolutely right, Ida said eagerly, getting to his feet and pushing his glasses further up the bridge of his nose. His enthusiasm died quickly as he continued. A lot of troubling events have occurred over the last 2 weeks, and has severely affected the well-being of a lot of you, including myself, I admit. However, right now, there is nothing we can do to change the situation. What happened is, unfortunately, behind us, and all we can do is move on. Right, Yaoyorozu stammered, wandering slowly over to a cupboard that Shinso had seen her routing around in the day before, after he'd come back from the radio station with Jiro. It hadn't been a good night. The show ended on the last note of Jiro's song, but she and Shinso had stayed behind for a good hour. Ida had been right. Mentally, they were not okay. Shinso had experienced his fair share of mental strife. This had hit him more than he ever thought it could. He was most certainly not alone in that sense. So, I thought that, in the meantime, maybe we could set aside a few evenings like this to sort things out, she suggested eagerly, bending down to the route through that cupboard. And I thought that maybe we could start with, she turned around with a brilliant smile on her face, board games. Kill me now, Shinso groaned quietly as he took a swig of his coffee. Todoroki smirked. I have never done them before, she continued, but I thought it would be a great way to spend some time together. Bakugo stood up again in another attempt to leave. And you're not allowed to skip it, she snapped coldly. Watch me, Bakugo hissed back. Shinso sighed. As much as he hated it, Yaoyorozu and Ida were onto something. Shinso had really ruined the friendships in this class. The least he could do was tag along in whatever mad attempts they had to salvage them. He turned to Bakugo. What? Afraid you'll lose? Bakugo stopped in his tracks. Want to bet? He growled, turned on his heel, and marched back towards Yaoyorozu. He snatched the first board game in the pile in her arms to read the label. These are all stupid. Or maybe you're just a stupid one. Okay, that wasn't Shinso's best insult. But in the small period of time that he'd really known Bakugo, he'd already understood that there was one way to get his attention properly, and that was competition. There's 19 of us, interjected Ida. We could split the group into 2 halves with one judicator, then play a series of games, with the team with the most wins at the end of the night being announced as victorious. Excellent, Yaoyorozu said eagerly. I don't mind being the judicator, unless you would prefer that role. It's your idea, so whatever you'd like, Ida nodded. Perhaps you could be so tonight, and I'll do it next time. Sounds like a plan. Yaoyorozu really was excited about this prospect. Okay, so, how should we split up the class? I'll choose a team, and then so will I, Bags. Shinso gave Bakugo a look, raising an eyebrow as he drank the rest of his coffee. Sounds like a plan, he said, repeating Yaoyorozu's words. Are you sure we should? Started Yaoyorozu, probably referring to fracturing the class even further down the middle, but Shinso personally thought that this was the best way of doing it. Working together with Bakugo at this stage would probably just make things worse. He never wanted to be friends with him, not a chance. But classmates and rivals? Those were terminologies that he'd be happier resorting to. First things first, survive the night. I choose Kirishima, Bakugo started. Todoroki, Shinso said immediately after, just because he'd given him coffee and deserved a reward. Raccoon Eyes, Jiro, Dunce Face. I hate how we know who he's referring to, Kaminari grumbled as he wandered over to Bakugo's claim side of the room. It wasn't long before the class was split evenly in two. Yaoyorozu stood in the center of the room with her pile of board games, whilst the two teams of 9 perched on and around the sofas. She pulled a large white sheet of paper from her arm, making it with her quirk, and then pinned it up to the wall. Finally, with a marker pen that she could have taken from her pocket, or just as easily formed it with her quirk, she drew a line down the middle, and wrote Team Shinso and Team Bakugo across the top of both sides. Okay! Yaoyorozu clapped her hands and beamed. Shinso glanced across the room at Bakugo and gave him one of his best, cruel grins. Bakugo's response was more determined, but it was most certainly an improvement. Yaoyorozu didn't seem to notice. What shall we do first? They moved Midoriya from the warehouse to a new location, of which he never really had the time to appreciate. The atmosphere was tense and uncertain. Compress had been taken somewhere to allow him to recover from the amputation of his arm. Where? Well, Midoriya couldn't know for sure. He hoped he was okay. Midoriya frowned, scratching at the bandages on his face. Should he be worried for the welfare of a villain? Someone who kidnapped him, no less? But Midoriya was frightened. The villains spoke in front of him of their plans, mainly because they knew that he couldn't repeat them. They didn't think as far as sign language or writing. Without being able to even leave, there wasn't much point in worrying. Although Midoriya hadn't been completely sure on what they were originally aiming towards, their direction now was clear. Shigaraki had a deck of cards out before him on an old desk, and amongst them lay Overhaul's business card. Midoriya stared at him from across the room. His wrist had been reattached to the wall behind them, just below a window and welded in place by Dabi as soon as he'd arrived to assess the damage that had been done in his absence. He wasn't pleased. Are you going to do it? Questioned Toga. Midoriya wasn't sure if he was more or less scared of her now, since she was acting so much less cuddly. She was sitting on a sofa that was particularly falling apart as she twirled a knife between her fingers, staring at Meng's magnet, which had been cleaned up and propped up against the wall. Shigaraki looked up at Midoriya, who glared back at him, picking at the place where the chain was attached to the wall absent-mindedly. Not quite how they wanted, he replied coldly. Dabi, give me a phone. No disputes were made, excluding the rolling of Dabi's eyes. He left the hideout as Shigaraki began to waltz towards Midoriya, scattering the playing cards as he went. He grasped the front of Midoriya's hoodie and pulled him to his feet. His fist was wrenched back by the chain. It felt shorter this time. You should have just joined us, he hissed. We could have avoided all this trouble. You shouldn't have taken my voice, Midoriya would have said. Instead, he just bared his teeth beneath his mask. The growl he let out and the narrowing of his eyes was enough to get his point across. Shigaraki tossed him back to the floor roughly, yanking at his arm. The cuff was starting to chafe. You're giving him away, right, Tomura? Toga frowned, sitting up, clearly displeased by the idea. The villain glared down at him and repeated the words Midoriya had heard far too many times over the past 2 weeks. He's still an important piece. Important piece. Midoriya curled up against the wall again, his shaking hand rising up to pick at the wall. It was the only thing he could bring himself to do. Is that all I am? Just a piece of their plans? When's Seiko coming back? Toga questioned, probably referring to Compress. Soon, Spinner replied, hauling himself up onto the iron frame of the disused bed. Garen is coming to fix him up with a mechanical arm. Oh, think you'd want to meet Canary? Midoriya's nails weren't pleased by the action of picking at the wall. He was practically shredding them, but it was all he could focus on. Maybe we shouldn't show Garen's face to him, advised Spinner, since you insist on keeping him alive. If he gets out, he can give the heroes a lot of information on us. He's not getting out, Shigaraki insisted, starting to pack away his cards. He glanced down at him again. And even if he does, he can't say anything. In a bout of frustration, Midoriya dug his nails so far into the wall that he felt a sharp sting of pain shoot through his fingernails, and the wall fall apart beneath them. The villains didn't notice the slightest movement of panic as Midoriya held the melted lump at the end of the chain against the wall, hoping they wouldn't realize that it was no longer attached. It had only been a temporary arrangement. They could either make the binding more secure, or they basically leased Midoriya out to Overhaul. They must have thought he'd given up on escaping. Well, that certainly wasn't the case, because as Shigaraki disappeared to chase after Dabi in the pursuit of a phone, Midoriya was trying to position himself to look out of one of the windows without arousing suspicion, or pulling the wall apart much further. It was late. The sun was setting over a city, illuminating the back alley that this building was a part of. There was scaffolding on the building next door, old and seemingly abandoned. The cracks on the wall and the scorch marks surrounding them indicated that this may have been the scene of an old villain attack. The building was practically falling apart, hence the scaffolding. Midoriya wasn't sure if it was safe to stand on. Could he even get through the window? He let his free hand reach up and feel for a latch. The window itself was composed of 2 rather large glass panes, with a simple strip of wood, splitting the 2 vertically. But no, there was no latch. The window couldn't be opened. He could go after the door, but Shigaraki could be just outside. Either way, to get there, he would have to run past all the other villains. No, he'd have to risk the window if he wanted to stand a chance. Midoriya's heart was beating 100 miles an hour as he further assessed the situation. Rather surprisingly, none of the windows were as damaged as the rest of the derelict flat. Okay. He took a deep breath in hopes to calm himself down. There was a chair within arm's reach. He pulled it towards himself, catching Toga's eye in the process. So, he sat atop of it, still holding onto the crumbling wall without arousing much suspicion. It wasn't that weird knowing to sit on the chair rather than the cold, hard floor. He sat there and watched the movements of the villains for a moment more. Dabi and Shigaraki were outside, twice with his compress elsewhere, getting treatment for the loss of his arm. Toga was on the other side of the room, still on that sofa. The closest to him was, in fact, Spinner. He was certainly the most immediate danger. He was looking at Midoriya right now, narrowing his eyes. Midoriya looked back as innocently as he could muster. Perhaps that made it look even more suspicious. Spinner got up from the box he had been perched on. Midoriya flinched. Into the ground fell a little lump of rubble. They stared at it, and then at each other. Midoriya dropped the end of his chain, tugged as hard as he could, and away it came. Turning with the twisting elegance of dance, he picked up the chair he had been sitting on and tossed it at the window behind him, praying it wouldn't just ricochet off. Thankfully, the window was just as structurally sound as the rest of the building and was shattered at the impact with ease. He didn't hesitate at the sight of jagged glass and threw himself out the window just as Spinner's claws reached for the hem of his hoodie. There was a yell as his feet made contact with the edge of the windowsill, the glass cutting at the exposed skin of his legs beneath his shorts. He propelled himself forward without daring to look down, reaching forward in a desperate hope to get out of there. The world moved in slow motion as he moved through the air across the gap between the buildings, the tune of his wings rising up in his throat upon learnt instinct, although it could never reach the tip of his non-existent tongue. But then his hand grasped the metal scaffolding, and he yanked himself onto the wobbling platform, his foot crashing through the rotting wood. "Shigaraki!" Midoriya heard Spinner cry. There was no time to lose. Pulling his foot free, he charged down the length of scaffolding, hearing the old structure creak and groan beneath him. He reached the end once more and leapt into the sky. The wind in his hair, the fading sunlight on his face, a feeling of freedom he longed to keep forevermore. Gravity took over once again, and with a tuck and a roll, he landed comfortably on the roof of the next building along, a little lower than the other 2, but now wasn't the time to take a breather. Wrapping the length of chain around his arm, Midoriya silently thanked Mr. Aizawa for his parkour lessons, and took off across the roof, bounding over to the next one, and then the one after that, hearing the distant screams of the villains behind him. A glance over his shoulder as he went revealed that he hadn't quite gotten away yet. But without Kurogiri around, Midoriya knew he had the slightest chance. That was a chance he was willing to take. True or false? The Earth becomes 12 tons heavier every year because of meteorites landing on it. Mina narrowed her eyes at Shinso as he grinned at her mercilessly. Please get it wrong, please get it wrong, please get it wrong. There's no way. Meteorites are tiny, protested Kirishima. Tell that to the dinosaurs, Zero scoffed. Guys, you're not allowed to help Mina, Yorzo reminded them for the 100th time. Mina was busy trying to get through Shinso's poker face, and failing. False, she decided on. Shinso just kept grinning. It's true, isn't it? She sighed. Why are you so good at this? I think maybe you're just bad at it, Mina, Sue pointed out. Shinso was liking Tsuyu more and more. Mina just groaned loudly and fell backwards to throw a mini tantrum on the floor as Shinso claimed the card for his team. Okay, who's next from Bakugo's team? Yoyozo questioned. Oh, let me go, Hagakure exclaimed as her floating pajamas bounced up and down. Yeah, try and see through Hagakure's poker face, Mina laughed. Who is guessing for Shinso's team? Pressed Yoyozo. Have you all had a go? I believe Jiro is next, Ida nodded. Go on, now! Uraraka cried, punching the air excitedly. Jiro scooted towards the front of the group as Hagakure picked up a card from the dwindling pile of facts. In some parts of northern Chile, it hasn't rained for over 400 years. Jiro replied immediately, true, and then held out her hand to accept the card. Canary has said that one before. It's in the Atacama Desert. When did he say that? Ida frowned. When we were complaining about it raining all the time, Jiro answered. Yeah, and Midoriya said he didn't have an umbrella since the last one got vandalized. Shinso shot a look at Bakugo. Well, I didn't freaking do it, he hissed back. Guys, come on, we were doing so well, Kirishima sighed. At the game? Because we really haven't, Sato pointed out, glancing at their small collection of cards in comparison to Shinso's team. The game was to guess whether the fact read out was true or false. Get it right, and your team keeps the card. Get it wrong, and it goes to the other team. Simple enough, but Midoriya's constant spout of knowledge seemed to have infected most of Shinso's friends, and consequently, they had realized that, if they'd never heard the fact before, there was a good chance it was made up, and thus false. Shinso had the entire aria on his team, alongside Tokoyami, who Shinso had been talking to from time to time ever since summer camp, Koda, which was an obvious choice, and finally Yasui, who Uraraka had insisted on having on their team, and Shinso was glad he'd agreed. Everyone else, excluding Yoyozu, of course, had ended up with Bakugo, who had become rather frustrated at the first game they'd attempted playing. There's only 3 cards left, pointed out Jiro. We've definitely won this round, so should we just move on to the next game? Bakugo didn't look too pleased, but the others did, so, as they started cleaning up the scattered cards, Yoyozu drew the first tally line on the scoreboard and moved to the other available games. What should we play next? She asked, spreading them out across the table as soon as the cards were out of the way. Not Monopoly, Ojiro sighed. That'll take forever. Cluedo? Suggested Uraraka. Yeah, and Momo could choose the killer and the weapon and stuff, Hagakure said gleefully. Okay, sounds fun. I don't know what it is though, so you may have to explain the rules, she grinned. We have 8 players on each team, and the maximum is 6, Todoroki replied, checking the back of the box. Okay then, she frowned. Why don't the team leaders choose just 3 people, excluding or including themselves, to be the players? Me, weird hair and arms, Bakugo decided instantly. I'm assuming that's me? Shoji questioned hesitantly. Right. Who wants to play for our team? Shinso asked, turning back to them. Even better, who actually knows how to play this game? I've played it with my siblings once or twice, Sue admitted. I can't remember the last time I played it, but I definitely have at some point, Jiro sighed. Right, there we have it then, Shinso nodded. Okay, and then if the others pair up with the players from their teams, I think... yours are instructed, with one person having 2 people with them. And then no one else can help the others, even if they're on the same team, suggested Ida. Sounds like a good idea, Yoyozo nodded as she poured herself some more tea. Right, then. How do we play this? Footfalls against hard concrete, echoing up the dark alleyways. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was to get away. Midoriya skidded to a halt at the end of the alley as a torrent of blue flame blocked his path, scorching the ends of his hair. You won't be getting away that easily, Dabby hissed as he came into view, ready to blast him again. Midoriya turned on his heel to run in the other direction, but faltered when he saw Spinner there, a singular sword unsheathed. But Spinner had left at the same time as Toga, so if he was there, then... Midoriya swung around wildly behind him, his fist making contact with the side of Toga's head, making her drop the blade that was seconds away from digging into his shoulder. In panic, he ran down the last remaining alleyway as Toga recovered. He knew what was coming before it happened. Shigaraki was standing there, waiting for him. Midoriya charged forwards, determined to get past, but the villain lunged before he had expected him to, grasping the end of the chain that persisted to dangle from Midoriya's wrist. He tripped as his arm was pulled backwards, and within seconds, Shigaraki had him pinned against the wall, his hand around his neck. So difficult, he snarled as Midoriya struggled to get away, pulling at the villain's hand in vain. Good job, sighed Dabby as the others caught up with Shigaraki. Man, Toga panted. I really thought he was going to get away for a second there. Shigaraki's fury grew greater, pushing Midoriya further into the wall as he choked. If you weren't so vital to our future operations, I would kill you. Right here, right now. Midoriya kicked and growled. He wouldn't be going back without a fight. He wouldn't. Spinner seemed to realize this. Now what? He groaned. There's no way we'll get him back easily. Listen here, Shigaraki growled, his eyes practically glowing in anger. You're going to follow us back, and you aren't going to dare try something like that again. Midoriya cried out something indistinguishable. Even he wasn't sure what he had tried to say, as he scratched at Shigaraki's skin. If you don't do as I say, then we'll go and get you a little friend. Midoriya's eyes grew wide, shaking as he hesitated in his efforts to free himself. Shigaraki smiled. The UA students are in their dorms now, so they'll be a little harder to reach. But we could take any one of the idiots wearing a happy little Canary jumper, pluck them off the streets, and you two could spend some time with us together. How's that for an idea? Midoriya stared at him for a moment, trying to read his expression underneath that dismembered hand which covered his face. It wasn't hard to tell that he was serious. He was chopped to the ground. Midoriya gasped for air by Shigaraki's feet, coughing and sputtering. Damn it! He was so close. But now what? He couldn't put someone else in this position. If he dared flee again, how could he know that they wouldn't take revenge? Get up, Shigaraki hissed, kicking Midoriya in the side for good measure. Bastard! Trembling, Midoriya managed to do as he was told, hanging his head in his depressive state. Let's go, Shigaraki nodded, and he began to march away. He wavered for a moment, but eventually complied. Midoriya didn't know what made him move his feet as he followed the villain back. Toga skipped alongside behind him, complaining that he was moving too slowly from time to time, so Dabby jabbed him harshly in the back. But it wasn't long before Midoriya stopped altogether, gazing at his feet. The villains were dead silent for a moment. He knew they must have been staring at him. Was this it? Was this him giving up? What else could he do? He couldn't get out, and no one was coming for him. Were the heroes even looking for him anymore? Had they given up, too? Did they think he was dead? Overhaul had... Come on, Canary! Toga called out to him. He let his head droop lower, and he took a step forward, finally accepting his fate. Which was then when it happened. Into his leg, a small white mass had tumbled. Midoriya blinked. It was a little girl, bandages covering her arms and legs, possibly even under that rag-like dress she wore. With watery red eyes, she gazed up at him, her long gray-white hair pouring like waterfalls over one of them. Eri? Someone called out. The girl flinched, not getting up as she looked over her shoulder, still down another street. Hey, what's going on? Toga exclaimed, hurrying back over to them. Who's that? But Midoriya was a little more transfixed on the man who just stepped out of the shadows. He narrowed his eyes. Fancy running into you here, Canary, said Overhaul. We suspect that it was, Uraraka stated menacingly. Colonel Mustard in the living room with the candlestick, Asui finished. Bakugo showed her a card with the same type of aggression that one would flip up their middle finger, and Uraraka groaned loudly. Back to the drawing board, she sighed. I'm not the freaking murderer, Bakugo cried out in frustration. Well, we know that now, Shinso said, rolling his eyes. Write that in our notebook, Ida. Of course, Ida exclaimed as eagerly crossed off Colonel Mustard as a suspect. Wait, you've got to move the weapon to the living room. If there's no weapon in the room, the suspects used their quirk, remember? Jiro recalled, doing just that after she rolled the dice for her turn. Anyway, damn it, why do I always roll such small numbers? At least you're still in the game, Kaminari sighed melodramatically, since he and Kirishima made an accusation way too early and were already out of the game. The challenge was to figure out who was the murderer, where, and what the weapon was. The cards with those details on were in Yaoyorozu's hand, whilst the rest were either in the pile or held by the others. You could suspect someone, and then the others had to prove you were wrong by showing you one of their cards. But if you made an accusation that was wrong, then you were completely out of the game. Right, Ida, Todoroki, it's our go, Shinso announced, retrieving the dice off Jiro. Don't roll it over my character again, she pouted, which made him keen to do just that, but he didn't, because he was such a good friend. Speaking of which, it had taken him a while to realize that. They were his friends. Not just Midoriya's friends, or who he hung out with purely because of that. Without Midoriya around, he'd finally come to terms with the fact that he had friends other than Midoriya. That didn't make him miss him any less, though. Okay, we're in a room. Are we suspecting anyone? Shinso asked Ida. He was the one in charge of their notebook and suspects, but Todoroki was the one making up the theories. Neither of them had played the game before, and frankly, neither had Shinso. However, Todoroki was eerily good at it. We're making an accusation, Todoroki announced. A series of oohs rang out across the room. The local conspiracy theorist strikes again, Jiro smirked. You sure? Shinso questioned, raising an eyebrow. He nodded confidently, and that was enough for Shinso. Alright then. Colonel Mustard, with his quirk, in the library. I just freaking said, Bakugo started, but was quickly interrupted by none other than Yaoyorozu. She grinned. He's right. What? He yelled. Yes, Puffin, Shinso laughed. I'm not the villain, Bakugo yelled. That's not how the game works, Bakugo. It's alright, man, Kirishima said, trying to calm him down. Yeah, the civilians are trying to figure out who the villain is before the heroes come and the police arrest all of them, supposed Ojiro. And then why is the villain trying to solve the case, frowned Mina. I guess to not arouse suspicion, said Yaoyorozu. Yeah, what if Bakugo accused himself, added Zero. That wouldn't make sense. He's handing himself in. Whatever. It's a pre-Quirk era game, right? Kirishima pointed out. Of course, there are bound to be weird plot holes or something when they tried to make it more relevant. Anyway, Shinso's team gets another point, Yaoyorozu announced, getting up to add the tally. This is stupid. I'm going to bed, Bakugo proclaimed, tossing his cards onto the board and getting up. Shinso sighed. It looked like he'd have to save the day again. No need to be such a sore loser. I'm not a sore loser, he yelled, and I haven't freaking lost yet. Let me choose the next game. Shinso grinned. He was so easy to manipulate that he didn't even need to think about using his quirk. Bakugo took the box after box out of Yaoyorozu's arms, discarding each one of them, until finally, all she was left was a pack of cards with the top heroes from a few years ago detailed among them. He snatched it off her and held it up to the group. Who here can play poker? Me! Yelled Mina, raising her hand eagerly. Alongside her, it was Kaminari, Shoji, Hagakure, and Jiro who knew how to play. Everyone else's hands remained stubbornly lowered. Bakugo sighed. Of freaking course. Alright, how about Go Fish? That got a few more responses. That one's easier to explain, Yaoyorozu nodded, who was one of those who knew the game. If we do it the same as last time, but have pairs instead, so 8 teams in total playing? Sounds good, exclaimed Hagakure, who, due to her invisible nature, was probably pretty good at card games. And so, Yaoyorozu handed out cards as everyone else moved chairs around in a circle, ensuring that no one close to them would be able to see their cards. So, she began, for those who do not understand, you'll have 7 cards to begin with, and your task is to collect as many sets of 4 as possible. For example, the 9 of hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades makes 1 set of 9s. You can then put them set down in front of you on the table, and you get a point. The group with the most points at the end wins. When it's your go, you can ask any of the other teams if they have a certain card. Let's say, if you're trying to get a set of 3s, and currently you only have 2 of them. You could ask then, Bakugo, do you have any 3s? And if he does, he has to hand one over. If he doesn't, you pick one up from the pile here. Go fish! Hagakure cried. Exactly, Yaoyorozu said, clapping her hands together. Let's start with someone who definitely knows how to play so that everyone who doesn't can get used to it. Eye bags, Bakugo said out of the blue. Shinso blinked at him in confusion before he added, Got any kings? He wavered before actually figuring out that he was being asked. Todoroki, who was somehow paired up with him, beat him to it. Go fish. Is that right? Yeah, go fish. We don't have any kings, Shinso nodded. He tutted and picked up a card from the pile, letting Kirishima glance over his shoulder at his set. Okay, and we'll move to Bakugo's left next, Yaoyorozu decided, wandering around the room to check that everyone had gone into pairs. Oh, the other way around to last time then, Mina pointed out. She looked rather disappointed she wasn't going next. That's us, Uraraka said happily. Can you ask for cards you don't have any of the set yet? No, you have to have like 1 8 to ask for other 8s, Mina explained. Ah, okay, right. Kaminari and Sero, do you have any 10s, she guessed. No, Kaminari replied way too quickly. No lying, Jiro scowled. I'm not lying, he exclaimed. You have a 10. Right there, Yaozu said, stealing the 10 and giving it to Uraraka. I swear I didn't see that. Shinso frowned. Hey, Owl? Jiro replied. Can you tell if someone's lying by using your quirk? She hesitated. You know, I've never thought of that. That's a really cool idea, Raven, Uraraka said excitedly, flashing her cards unintentionally. She had a couple of queens. Oh, thanks, Shinso replied, paying more attention to the fact that he had the other 2 queens. It's kind of a thing that Midoriya would point out, Todoroki added. They all fell silent. Can I just... Uraraka started, but she quickly broke off. I miss him. I know we all haven't been talking about it for reasons, but I think we should. But no one said anything more for a moment, just staring at the cards and waiting for someone else to make the first move. I was looking forward to having him in our class, Jiro bravely announced. And I know he was gone even before the idea of dorms came around, but I couldn't stop thinking about all the stupid stuff we'd all get up to with him around. Shinso put his cards face down on his lap as he picked up Siren in her entire nest. Siren running rampage, he grinned. Really unnecessary random facts, Jiro added with an equal smile. Overanalyzing every little detail of everything, said Uraraka, leaning her head on Asui's shoulder. There would be music playing constantly, Jiro told the others. Probably in English, so you'd have no idea what's going on, and then he accidentally sends fire to something. There was a soft murmur of laughter across the group. Did I ever say he was in my dance class? Mina questioned. Yes, sighed Jiro. Many, many times. We could have given you all dance lessons, she finished, either ignoring Jiro's last comment or missing it completely. That would have been funny. You know, there's nothing stopping you from doing all these things now. That, weirdly enough, had come from Bakugo. Bakugo wants dance lessons, Mina yelled. I do not, he yelled back. I'm just saying that there's no need in moping around when you all don't have to wait for Deku to do any of this. Bakugo hesitated as he reorganized his hands of cards. Besides, he wouldn't want you to be like this. Shinso wavered. He almost smiled. But he knew Bakugo wouldn't get any more sympathetic than that. Uraraka, got any queens? Please, don't go. Midoriya stared, dumbfounded, at the little girl who had grasped onto the hem of his shorts. He was standing with a group of publicly recognized villains. He himself could have easily been one of them. Yet this girl, Eri, seemed so scared that she lashed onto anyone that wasn't him. Overhaul, Shigaraki snarled as he waltzed back into view. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, Overhaul replied, scratching at that beak-like plague mask of his. I thought your group moved out of town ever since the warehouse was found by the heroes. Heroes found the warehouse? Midoriya's eyes widened. Maybe he should have scratched his name into the wall. Anything to give them the slightest indication that he was still here. His heart started beating faster once more as his eyes drifted down to the girl by his feet. He couldn't let anyone else suffer this fate. Midoriya bent down and scooped Eri up into his arms. She clutched onto his tattered body, a little horn on the side of her head digging into the side of his neck. Overhaul glared at him. Put her down, Canary. This is none of your business. Don't let her go, snapped Shigaraki. Midoriya wasn't planning on doing so anyway, but he took a few steps away from the villains, narrowing his eyes as he tried to figure out what was going on. Did you think about calling me? Overhaul questioned Shigaraki, tearing his eyes away from Midoriya for a moment as he diverted the topic. I would have done if Canary hadn't decided to try and run off. Didn't get that far then. Midoriya growled at him. The light determination that had been flicking on and off for the past few weeks was coming back in full force now that there was someone else to protect thrown into the mix, other than himself. This isn't the place to be discussing such matters anyway, Overhaul sighed. Call me and we can organize a proper meeting. Midoriya noticed how Toga's blade was pointing in Overhaul's direction rather than his now. Spinners did the same. None of them were keen to get along with the man who had killed one of their own. Silently, Midoriya agreed. Come, Eri. Midoriya gripped tightly onto the back of Eri's dress, his eyes alight with an unspoken fury as the girl trembled in his arms. Overhaul simply sighed again. I'd rather not make a mess. Besides, you'll be joining her soon enough. Who's the girl? Shigaraki insisted, repeating Toga's unanswered question. Your daughter? Not exactly, he replied, taking a step closer as Midoriya moved away. Come on, Canary. We haven't got all day. No, I think we'll keep a hold of her, Shigaraki grinned menacingly. And then we'll have that meeting before we decide on what to do with her. How does that sound? Overhaul's hand moved towards the top of the glove on his other. I thought we'd moved past all this killing each other business. We won't be killing anyone tonight, Shigaraki leered, but you will be serving under us once we're through with you. This time, you have no backup, and we have a little more firepower. Dabby! Gladly, said Dabby stepped forward from the shadow, his fist burning with his infamous blue flame. You will regret this, snapped Overhaul, tossing his glove to the ground, and I will be taking Airy and Canary with me, he yelled as the blue fire was thrown towards him, a wall of flame forming between the villains and Midoriya. Which is when he took his chance. He turned on his heel, straight into his grip on Airy, and he ran. No! Where are you going? Airy whispered into his shoulder. He'll kill you. His escape wasn't panic this time, fueled by someone drunk on the taste of freedom. This was no longer some desperate, failing attempt to break out of the chains that held him back. He would get out of here, and Airy was coming with him, whether the villains liked it or not. It didn't take long for them to realize Midoriya was on the move again, though. However, now that the two opponents were present, they weren't as quick on their feet. They tussled with their power, throwing blows left and right as they stumbled over each other to pursue Midoriya. Canary had started to cry, her trembling form gazing over Midoriya's shoulder as she watched the villains yell and scream. Midoriya held her closer and began humming in her ear, a tune that his quirk would have used to calm her down if he could access it at all. He ducked around the corner as he caught a glimpse of Toga tossing one of her knives in their direction. Airy screamed in fright, but Midoriya kept going. He had to lose their trail somehow. Down alley after alley, street after street, Midoriya ran. His muscles did not ache, and his breath did not hitch. He just kept going, deaf to everything but Airy's wails. Until the light of the city hit him in full force. With a free hand, he pulled up his hood and managed to tuck the trailing chain under the sleeve of his hoodie, and he stepped out into the gently heaving crowd of the evening commute. Out on the pavement, he hesitated and glanced behind him. A panting figure stood, with one hand against the wall, his eyes wide and wild as he saw Midoriya step out into normality. If Overhaul acted now, his criminal status would be revealed to the world, and he would be arrested immediately. He couldn't even accuse Midoriya of kidnapping his daughter, because this was Canary, missing for over 2 weeks at the hands of some of the most dangerous villains in the country. With Overhaul framed against the shadows, and Midoriya against the glow of civilization, they parted ways. Midoriya walked in silence for a moment, dodging the people who gave him funny looks as he passed by with Airy in his arms. Eventually, he stopped, and let the first smile for half a month stretch across his damaged face. He was free.